Jorge Avila Torres. In May 2005, the small community of Zion, Illinois, was devastated when the bodies of two young girls, 8-year-old Laura Hobbs and 9-year-old Crystal Tobias, were discovered stabbed to death in a wooded area. Laura's father, Jerry Hobbs, was immediately arrested and spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial after police extracted a false confession. Years later, DNA testing revealed he was innocent, and that same evidence instead identified a different suspect, Jorge Avila Torres, a U.S. Marine who had grown up in the same neighborhood. By 2009, Avila Torres was stationed at Marine Corps Base Quantico in Virginia. On July 10th of that year, he murdered 20-year-old Navy intelligence specialist Amanda Jean Snell inside her barracks room. He strangled her and left her body hidden in a footlocker. Investigators tied him to the crime in 2010, when he was also linked to a string of kidnappings and sexual assaults in Arlington, Virginia. In April 2014, a federal jury in Virginia convicted Avila Torres of Snell's murder. Prosecutors presented additional evidence showing his pattern of abductions and rapes, and the jury sentenced him to death on April 24, 2014. That same year, Illinois prosecutors also moved forward in the Zion case. In September 2018, Avila Torres pleaded guilty in Lake County to the murders of Laura Hobbs and Crystal Tobias. He was sentenced to 100 years in prison, 50 years for each child's death. Avila Torres' death sentence was upheld by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2017, but in December 2024, President Joe Biden commuted that sentence to life without parole. Cesar Armando Laurian. In December 2007, 20-year-old Lance Corporal Maria Lauterbach, who was 8 months pregnant, disappeared from her home near Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Lauterbach had previously accused fellow Marine Corporal Cesar Armando Laurian of sexual assault in May 2007, telling military officials she feared for her safety. Her sudden disappearance raised immediate suspicion. Investigators later discovered blood evidence inside Laurian's Jacksonville home, and in January 2008 they unearthed a shallow grave in his backyard containing the burned remains of Lauterbach and her unborn child. The discovery turned the case into a homicide investigation. Laurian fled to Mexico in January 2008, sparking a months-long international manhunt. He was captured 4 months later, in April 2008, by Mexican authorities in the small town of Tacambaro, Michoacan, and extradited back to the United States to stand trial. In 2010, Laurian was tried in Onslow County, North Carolina. Prosecutors presented evidence of the murder, the attempt to burn the bodies, and his flight from justice. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, theft, and fraud for using Lauterbach's ATM card. On August 24, 2010, Laurian was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Louie Ray Perez. In April 2012, Brittany Kilgore, a 22-year-old Marine wife living in Fallbrook, California, disappeared after agreeing to go out with Staff Sergeant Louie Ray Perez, a Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton. Days later, her body was discovered near Lake Skinner in Riverside County. An autopsy revealed she had been strangled. Investigators learned that Perez was part of a sadomasochistic circle with 2 women, Dorothy Maraglino and Jessica Lopez. According to prosecutors, Brittany Kilgore had been lured under false pretenses and then murdered as part of a violent plan orchestrated by the trio. Jessica Lopez was later found in a San Diego motel, covered in blood and leaving behind a suicide note that detailed involvement in the killing. At trial in 2015, the prosecution presented evidence that Perez was the central figure who masterminded the crime. Jurors heard how his need for control and his obsession with violent sexual practices led directly to Brittany Kilgore's death. In October 2015, Louie Ray Perez, Dorothy Maraglino, and Jessica Lopez were all convicted of first-degree murder. On November 19, 2015, Perez and Maraglino were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Lopez received a sentence of life with the possibility of parole, and a judge later imposed additional consecutive life terms on Lopez in January 2016. The sentences closed the horrifying case in which a Marine in uniform by day lived a secret life of violence that ultimately ended in the killing of a young Marine's wife. Jonathan Law. In early November 2009, Marines at Camp Lejeune discovered a horrifying scene when Corporal Joshua Hartzell was found dead on base, the victim of a brutal assault. An autopsy confirmed he died from blows to the head, and investigators quickly identified another Marine, Private Jonathan Law, as the suspect. He was taken into custody within days of the killing, and formal murder charges were filed against him. More than a year later, on December 14, 2010, Jonathan Law appeared before a military judge at Camp Lejeune, where he admitted his role in the killing of Corporal Hartzell by pleading guilty to the charge of murder. On January 20, 2011, the court-martial concluded with a decisive verdict, and Jonathan Law was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In addition, he was dishonorably discharged from the Marine Corps and ordered to forfeit all pay and allowances. Curtis Lee Kruger. Curtis Lee Kruger, a first lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps stationed at Camp Pendleton, was drawn into a violent case that shocked Southern California. In May 2018, the body of 54-year-old Henry Allen Stange of Murrieta was discovered in a shallow grave near Joshua Tree National Park. He had been beaten and stabbed to death, and his body hurriedly buried in the desert. Investigators learned that Henry Allen Stange had been involved in a tangled relationship connected to Kruger's girlfriend. Prosecutors said that on May 23, 2018, Kruger and his accomplice lured Stange into a garage in Murrieta, where a brutal assault unfolded. Evidence showed that Stange was struck repeatedly and stabbed before his body was loaded into a vehicle and later buried in the desert. Forensic findings, cell phone records, and witness accounts all tied Kruger to the killing. In Riverside County Superior Court in 2020, jurors heard testimony that the assault was fueled by jealousy and anger. On September 28, 2020, the jury returned its verdict, finding Kruger guilty of second-degree murder and assault causing great bodily injury. On October 22, 2020, Kruger appeared in court to learn his fate. The judge sentenced him to 18 years to life in state prison. In the courtroom, members of Stange's family described the pain and devastation the crime had caused, while the judge made clear that Kruger's rank and service would not shield him from accountability for the killing. Mikhail Schmidt. In March 2017, 37-year-old construction worker Jacob Bravo was finishing his day at a site in Oceanside, California, when he was ambushed. The man who killed him was Mikhail Schmidt, a Marine veteran and former combat instructor. Prosecutors said Schmidt had been lying in wait and carried out the stabbing as part of what they described as a thrill killing. During questioning, Schmidt gave a series of bizarre accounts. He claimed at one point that nanobots had been implanted in his brain and that a secret government program called Agent Orange had ordered him to kill. In court, he testified about multiple head injuries and post-traumatic stress from his military service, but prosecutors argued that these explanations were attempts to disguise a calculated predatory attack. In September 2019, a San Diego County jury convicted Schmidt of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of lying in wait. In a separate phase, jurors considered his plea of insanity and found him legally sane at the time of the killing. On October 22, 2019, Schmidt returned to court for sentencing, and after hearing from Bravo's family, the judge sentenced him to the maximum penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kwame Adam Carpenter. He was convicted in 2019 of murdering his 24-year-old wife Maureen Gatwa and their 6-month-old son Kyan. The killings happened on June 22, 2015, inside an Anaheim apartment the couple shared with Gatwa's mother on the 2600 block of West Ball Road. According to prosecutors, the murders began after Gatwa confronted Carpenter about text messages he had exchanged with a female co-worker. During the argument, Gatwa picked up the baby and tried to leave, but Carpenter pulled out a butcher knife. He shoved her to the floor, kicked her in the head, and then fatally stabbed both his wife and their infant son. A deliveryman outside heard the disturbance and was asked by Gatwa to call 911, Witnesses saw her attempt to escape, but Carpenter dragged her back inside the apartment, and even when the building manager tried to intervene, Carpenter blocked her at the door and insisted nothing was wrong before fleeing in a Lincoln town car. Police said Carpenter was later found asleep in his vehicle at Fountain Valley Regional Hospital. When officers tried to arrest him, he drove off, leading police on a chase that reached speeds of up to 80 miles per hour before he eventually crashed near Miles Square Park, jumped into a lake in an attempt to escape, and was subdued with the help of police dogs. Carpenter was formally charged with 2 counts of murder with special circumstances and a sentencing enhancement for use of a deadly weapon. On February 26, 2019, a jury found him guilty on all counts, including the special circumstance of multiple murders, and 2 months later, on April 26, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christopher Brandon Lee. Under the relentless California sun in June 2014, 19-year-old Erin Corwin vanished after telling her husband she was going on a short trip. Erin, the young wife of a Marine stationed at 29 Palms, was secretly involved in an affair with her neighbor, Christopher Brandon Lee. She believed she might be pregnant with his child, and her friends later testified that she thought Lee was going to take her into the desert that day to celebrate, but instead, prosecutors said, he led her into a remote canyon where he strangled her and pushed her body down a mine shaft. For nearly 2 months, search teams combed the Mojave Desert in a desperate effort to find her. Suspicion quickly fell on Lee, who abruptly moved his family to Alaska after Erin's disappearance. Investigators uncovered that he had searched online for ways to dispose of a body and had driven Erin out into the desert on the day she went missing. On August 16, 2014, her remains were finally discovered at the bottom of a mine shaft, and the medical examiner determined that she had been strangled. Lee was arrested in Alaska and brought back to California to face trial. Prosecutors argued that Erin's pregnancy and the threat of exposure drove him to kill her. In the courtroom, Lee admitted that he strangled Erin but claimed it was not premeditated. The jury rejected his account, and in November 2016, he was convicted of first-degree murder, and a San Bernardino County judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nathaniel Cosby. On May 16, 2013, Ivan niece Ivy Harris, a 29-year-old woman from Las Vegas, was last seen alive leaving a Waikiki bar with Master Sergeant Nathaniel Cosby, a 38-year-old Marine stationed at Kananohe Bay. Days later, Harris's body was discovered near Yokohama Bay on Oahu's west coast. Investigators determined that Cosby had killed Harris in his hotel room before transporting her body to the remote location. Surveillance footage, phone records, and DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime. He was arrested at Honolulu International Airport as he attempted to leave the island and charged with murder, obstruction of justice, and patronizing a prostitute. In April 2014, Cosby was tried at Marine Corps Base, Hawaii. The prosecution argued that he strangled Harris during an encounter and then tried to cover it up by dumping her body. A military jury found him guilty of unpremeditated murder, obstruction of justice, and patronizing a prostitute. On April 3, 2014, the jury recommended that Cosby be sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. The sentence was later upheld, and his dishonorable discharge was confirmed by Marine Corps Pacific authorities. Stanford Morocho. In 2014, the San Diego community was shaken when 4-month-old Emilio Michael Harvey was found fatally injured while in the care of his father, 26-year-old Marine Lance Corporal Stanford Morocho. Prosecutors later revealed that the infant had suffered devastating trauma, including a fractured skull and broken ribs, injuries that doctors confirmed were consistent with violent abuse rather than an accident. Morocho was arrested and charged with murder, his uniform and military career overshadowed by the horrifying crime inside his own home. In court, prosecutors detailed how the baby's short life ended violently, pointing to evidence that Morocho inflicted the injuries that killed his son. He initially pleaded not guilty, but as the case built against him, the charges stood firm. In March 2016, he entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder, acknowledging responsibility for the death of Amelia. It was a shocking fall from grace for a Marine once trusted to protect others, now facing justice for destroying his own child's life. On May 6, 2016, inside a San Diego courtroom, a Superior Court judge sentenced Stanford Morocho to 15 years to life in prison. Eddie Ray Routh. On February 2, 2013, former U.S. Marine Eddie Ray Routh traveled with Navy SEAL Chris Kyle and Kyle's friend, Chad Littlefield, to Rough Creek Lodge in Erath County, Texas. The outing was meant to be therapeutic, as Kyle often spent time helping fellow veterans cope with trauma. Instead, within hours, both Kyle and Littlefield were shot dead at the shooting range. Eddie Ray Routh, born in 1987, served in the Marine Corps from 2006 until 2010, including deployments to Iraq and Haiti. After leaving active duty, he was repeatedly treated at Veterans Affairs hospitals for serious mental health problems, including schizophrenia, paranoia, and psychosis. According to family members, he often believed that people were plotting against him and described hearing disturbing voices. That afternoon at the range, Routh turned a gun on the two men who had invited him. Chris Kyle was shot in the back, and Chad Littlefield was struck multiple times in the chest and head. After the killings, Routh fled in Kyle's pickup truck and was later captured at his sister's home in Lancaster, Texas. During questioning, he admitted to the murders and said he believed Kyle and Littlefield were planning to hurt him. The case drew national attention because Kyle, already well known for his best-selling memoir American Sniper, had been portrayed in a Hollywood film just weeks before the trial began. In February 2015, Eddie Ray Routh stood trial in Erath County. His defense attorneys argued that he was insane at the time of the shootings, but prosecutors countered with testimony from experts who said Routh knew what he was doing and understood it was wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict for capital murder. On February 24, 2015, Eddie Ray Routh was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Eric Jamal Johnson. On New Year's Eve 2015, University of North Texas student Sarah Muchlechner, a 20-year-old film major, was driving friends home from a party in Denton, Texas. At around 2 a.m. on January 1, 2016, her car encountered a black SUV carrying former Marine Eric Jamal Johnson and several others. According to witnesses, words were exchanged after men in the SUV made comments toward Sarah's group. The verbal confrontation escalated, and Johnson, seated in the passenger seat, pulled out a handgun and fired multiple shots into Sarah's vehicle. One of the bullets struck Sarah in the head, causing her to lose control of the car and crash. She was rushed to the hospital but did not survive her injuries. Investigators quickly linked Johnson to the shooting through eyewitness statements, vehicle identification, and surveillance. Johnson fled Texas in the aftermath and was arrested days later during a traffic stop in Yuma, Arizona. At trial in Denton County, prosecutors argued that Johnson's actions were intentional and reckless, pointing to his decision to fire into a moving car filled with unarmed young people. The jury found him guilty of murder, and on June 27, 2017, Eric Jamal Johnson was sentenced to 44 years in prison. Under Texas law, he will not be eligible for parole until after serving at least half of that sentence. Lawrence McKee. Lawrence McKee was indicted by an Orleans Parish grand jury on December 8, 2016, for the second-degree murder of his friend, Larry Washington. He entered a plea of not guilty on January 5, 2017. The case went to trial in January 2019, where prosecutors argued that McKee deliberately shot Washington following a night of drinking. McKee claimed that Washington had attacked him and that the shot was fired in self-defense, striking Washington in the back after ricocheting. At trial, the jury heard testimony about McKee's 911 call and about messages he had sent prior to the shooting. The 911 recording captured him sounding distraught, but also revealed him cursing at Washington, which prosecutors highlighted to undermine his claim of panic. After 2 days of testimony, on January 24, 2019, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder by a 10-2 vote. On March 11, 2019, the trial court denied McKee's motion for a new trial and sentenced him to life imprisonment at hard labor without the benefit of probation, parole, or suspension of sentence. While his appeal was pending, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Ramos versus Louisiana in 2020, ruling that non-unanimous jury verdicts in felony cases were unconstitutional. Because McKee's conviction rested on a 10-2 verdict, the Louisiana Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal vacated his conviction and sentence and remanded the matter for further proceedings. Horace Van Volts, Jr. In the early 1980s, two young women in Los Angeles County were brutally murdered, and for decades their cases remained unsolved. In July 1981, 22-year-old Mary Duggan was found strangled in the trunk of her car in Burbank. And just months later, in October 1981, 21-year-old Selena Keough was discovered strangled and left on the side of a road in Montclair. Both killings showed signs of sexual assault, and investigators suspected they were linked, but without a suspect, the cases went cold. The man who would eventually be tied to the crimes was Horace Van Volts, Jr., a former Marine with a history of sexual assault charges. He had been tried in separate cases during the 1980s and early 2000s, but either walked free after acquittals or had charges dismissed after mistrials. Despite repeated suspicions, there was never enough evidence to connect him directly to Duggan or Keough. In 2019, the breakthrough came when investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to re-examine DNA recovered from the victims. Detectives submitted the samples to genealogical databases, and the results pointed squarely to Volts. He was arrested at his home in Newhall, California, on November 15, 2019, and charged with both murders. At trial in Los Angeles County in 2022, prosecutors presented the DNA evidence linking Volts to both women, along with testimony establishing the violent nature of the crimes, which included rape and sodomy. On August 18, 2022, a jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The conviction made him one of the first defendants in California convicted using forensic genealogy. On December 16, 2022, Volts was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The families of Mary Duggan and Selena Keough, who had waited more than 40 years for justice, finally saw the case resolved. Brian Carl Brimiger. In November 2011, Yvonne Baldelli, a 42-year-old woman from California, moved with her boyfriend, retired U.S. Marine Brian Carl Brimiger, to the island of Bocas del Toro in Panama. Prosecutors later revealed that the couple's relationship had been abusive, and soon after their arrival, Yvonne disappeared. Brimiger sent emails from Yvonne's account to her family and friends, attempting to make it appear as though she had left him for another man. Investigators discovered that Brimiger had brutally killed Yvonne, then dismembered her body with a machete and discarded the remains in a remote jungle area. He returned to California and continued to cover up the crime, withdrawing money from her bank account, lied to investigators, and destroyed evidence, including clothing and a mattress. Brimiger even involved a new girlfriend in concealing his actions, instructing her to dispose of incriminating items. In 2013, Brimiger was arrested in San Diego on charges including obstruction of justice. Federal prosecutors later charged him under U.S. law with committing murder abroad. In February 2016, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, admitting that he had fatally stabbed and dismembered Yvonne Baldelli in Panama. On May 25, 2016, in San Diego Federal Court, U.S. District Judge Jeffrey T. Miller sentenced Brian Brimiger to 26 years in prison. Kenneth Franklin Shinzato. In April 2016, 20-year-old Rina Shimabukuro went missing in Uruma, Okinawa. Her disappearance gripped the island with fear, and investigators soon focused on Kenneth Franklin Shinzato, a former U.S. Marine who was then working as a civilian contractor on Kadena Air Base. Shinzato admitted to sexually assaulting Rina, stabbing her to death, and abandoning her body in a remote area. The case provoked outrage across Japan, particularly because of his ties to the U.S. military presence in Okinawa. Prosecutors charged Shinzato with rape resulting in death, murder, and abandoning a body. During his trial at the Naha District Court in 2017, he pleaded guilty to the sexual assault and abandoning the body, but denied intent to kill. The court rejected his claims, concluding that his actions showed clear intent to end Rina's life. On December 1, 2017, the Naha District Court sentenced Kenneth Franklin Shinzato to life imprisonment. Brian Earl Johnston. On April 20, 2021, 27-year-old Kelly Wilkinson was murdered in the backyard of her Arundel home on the Gold Coast. Her estranged husband, Brian Earl Johnston, attacked her with a knife, stabbing her 8 times before dousing her in petrol and setting her body ablaze, all while her 3 young children were inside the house. Police discovered Johnston nearby with severe burns to his body, and he was arrested at the scene. It later emerged that Johnston had a history of violent and controlling behavior. He had been charged with rape in the months before the killing and was on bail when Kelly was murdered, and she had sought protection through a domestic violence order, but Johnston continued to pursue her. Court proceedings revealed that Johnston did not act alone in preparing for the crime. His co-worker, Bradley Bell, was accused of helping him gather tools and petrol in the days before the attack, and of driving him near Kelly's home. Bell faced a separate trial for his alleged involvement. In February 2024, nearly 3 years after the killing, Johnston pleaded guilty in the Supreme Court of Queensland in Brisbane. On March 13, 2024, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a mandatory minimum of 20 years before being eligible for parole. Kason Sykes. In October 2008, a brutal double murder in Riverside County shocked both the local community and the U.S. Marine Corps. Marine Sergeant Jan Pietrzak, a 24-year-old Iraq War veteran, and his 26-year-old wife Kiana Jenkins Pietrzak were found bound, gagged, tortured, and shot to death inside their Winchester, California home. Prosecutors later revealed that the killers spray-painted racial slurs on the walls before leaving the scene, intensifying the horror of the crime. Investigators quickly connected the murders to 4 men, all of whom had ties to Camp Pendleton. Among them was former Marine Kason Sykes, who had served in the Corps before his discharge. Alongside him were Tyrone Miller, Emrys John, and Kevin Cox, also ex-Marines. Authorities discovered that the men had targeted the Pietrzaks in a home invasion robbery, but what unfolded was far more sinister. According to trial testimony, the couple was humiliated, tortured, and then executed in their own home. The evidence against Sykes and the others was overwhelming. Stolen property from the Pietrzak residence was recovered. DNA linked the suspects to the crime, and statements from accomplices tied Sykes directly to the murders. During pre-trial proceedings, Sykes drew attention when he urinated in the courtroom, an outburst that led to a court-ordered mental evaluation. But despite these disruptions, the case against him moved forward. In August 2014, after years of proceedings, a Riverside County jury found Kason Sykes guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Jurors also upheld special circumstance allegations of multiple murder, robbery, and burglary, making him eligible for the death penalty. He was formally sentenced to death on November 7, 2014. John Patrick Wimunk. In July 2008, 2nd Lieutenant Holly Wimunk, an Army nurse stationed at Fort Bragg, was reported missing after a fire broke out in her Fayetteville apartment. Firefighters who responded quickly determined that the blaze had been intentionally set, pointing to arson. For days, investigators searched until they discovered Holly's burned remains in a wooded area near Camp Lejeune, more than 100 miles from her home. Her husband, Marine Corporal John Patrick Wimunk of Camp Lejeune, soon became the prime suspect. Holly had previously reported domestic violence, and court records revealed she had sought a protective order against him. Police and prosecutors described a violent and controlling relationship that had escalated fatally, and witnesses also recalled a heated argument between the couple shortly before she disappeared. On July 14, 2008, authorities charged Wimunk with first-degree murder, arson, and conspiracy to commit arson. The charges alleged that he killed his wife and then set fire to her apartment in an attempt to destroy evidence. The case drew widespread national attention because both husband and wife were military service members stationed in North Carolina. 2 years later, on September 13, 2010, John Patrick Wimunk entered a plea in a Fayetteville courtroom. He admitted guilt to first-degree murder, second-degree arson, and conspiracy to commit arson. By pleading guilty, Wimunk avoided the death penalty, and the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Cody Daniel Richardson. In September 2009, authorities in Jacksonville, North Carolina, discovered 21-year-old Jessie Lauer Richardson dead inside the couple's apartment. An autopsy determined that she had been strangled with a belt. Her husband, Corporal Cody Daniel Richardson of the 2nd Marine Regiment at Camp Lejeune, called 911 and admitted that he had left a note before turning himself in. Investigators confirmed that the couple's relationship had been volatile, and police charged him with first-degree murder. Richardson, who was 22 years old at the time of his arrest, was administratively separated from the Marine Corps soon afterward. Court proceedings moved forward in Onslow County Superior Court, where the state presented evidence of a violent domestic dispute that ended Jessie's life. On December 15, 2010, Richardson stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The court accepted his plea, and he was sentenced to a prison term of 19 to 24 years. In court, he offered an apology, but the sentence reflected the severity of taking his wife's life. If you enjoyed this and want to see more interesting videos, I'm going to be posting every day on this channel. I would really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Thank you very much.